Hi, it's John, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by an old friend, Haydn Shaughnessy. He's the founder of the Flow Academy. And welcome, Haydn. How are you?
Good morning, John. I'm pretty good, actually. Yeah.
It's always a bit awkward to start off one of these video interviews. It feels a little bit too virtual sometimes. And with that in mind, a lot of those who are going to be watching this won't know your background. So I always like to get started. Can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do in your work?
I have a kind of a strange background compared to most people in that you wouldn't say I'm an expert in any one particular area. Um, I began my professional career actually in broadcasting and then in the technology of satellite applications, which was just curious kind of a diversion. I was working as a broadcast journalist. I was offered the opportunity to work on satellite TV across borders in Europe, one of the first cross-border services, but got more interested in satellite delivery as a technology and went on then to work in tech for a long time and did a lot of product development. Uh, and then took another diversion, which was into the American think tank industry. So for about 10 years, I was working with American think tanks who were themselves working with some of the Fortune 100 companies like Coca-Cola. And we were really looking at their future operating model. So we were asking the question, how does technology affect the way you operate as a company? And around about that time, I think everybody was very fixed on the Michael Porter Five Forces operating model. That was fairly standard for a physical world business environment. But things were changing because the web was coming along and then mobile came along. And the way in which companies organize themselves fundamentally started to shift. And I was very much involved in that, in analyzing that kind of development, and then went on to apply some of that in the financial sector, asking the question, what's going to disrupt banks, and how can they preempt that by shifting their operating model? In my case, I was more focused on how can they preempt that by shifting to a platform and ecosystem operating model. Of course, that didn't happen very often, but that was the basic idea. That was at least what I wanted to see happen.
And yeah, maybe that bears a little bit more attention. Can you talk about what you had seen in other industries? I know you mentioned satellite and telecommunications, but for example, media went through quite a lot of disruption when the internet came along, and maybe give us a bit of a track record of what's been going on in FinTech as you see it in the meantime.
Yeah, well, I think that's an interesting set of questions in there. There's not just one question. I think what people were tending to think about with disruption is the Clayton Christensen model. So it was something like you will be found out by new entrants into your industry, and those new entrants will come in with a good enough product, not particularly great product, but it'll be low cost, and gradually they'll build market share. And once they've got market share, they will then seriously disrupt you. We actually don't see a huge amount of that. I think it was happening in areas that Christensen focused on, which are things like disk storage. So if you look at the 2000s, 1990s actually, we went from those big 5-inch disks down to 3.5-inch disks, and now we have massive storage on minute SSD cards. So there was a huge amount of very, very rapid innovation. And in that industry, you saw the Christensen model at work. Outside of that, though, I think what tends to happen is that disruption is very multifaceted, and it can be things like the arrival of digital. What digital does, and I don't want that to be too much of an umbrella term, it tends to be, but what digital does is gives you this opportunity to produce multiple versions or copies of what you want, something like Spotify, without actually creating a physical entity. So Spotify can stream all day long, and it doesn't actually cost Spotify a whole lot more to do that. So I think this shift to zero marginal cost is something that's been profoundly influential. And I think that's the big disruptor. And that's what a lot of companies, even though they are digital in many respects, can't get their heads around. Look at something like a bank. Very interesting example banks, actually. In the platform and ecosystem model, what you want to do is create a platform and develop an ecosystem where you're taking advantage of that zero marginal cost benefit. But banks have not done that. So they are naturally platforms. So if you go back to the 1990s, companies like Fidelity and Vanguard set up marketplaces for 401k investments. They didn't just sell their own funds, but they created a marketplace for funds. if you look at trading, banks are naturally trading platforms. So banks in their DNA are platforms, but they've never been able to manage that in their retail and commercial operations. And they've been very reluctant to sort of narrow down on what platforms take. This new operating model of platform is very singular at the start. It's like Amazon did books, and once it created its global capability in books, it then broadened out to other things. And what banks have never been able to do is to get hold of that idea and say, well, actually, we're probably best to do something like FX, retail FX, as our platform, and then build out from that and build out into things like trade finance, or even start with trade finance and then build out to FX. So to say reinvent yourself as a single product company and then create adjacencies and grow out from there. So it's a kind of shift towards zero marginal cost business that they've never been able to take.
Do you think or do you speculate about any of the reasons why that's been a slow turning point for the financial services industry to go into real platform business models? Does it have anything to do with regulation or with more fundamental things around the way finance works? That's something that Clayton Christensen also talks about a bit more recently.
I think that you're probably better placed than I am to make that judgment, because I'm not by background a banker. But the idea of it being regulation and regulation only, I think we all see through that at this stage. The regulations actually help banks not to be disrupted. So regulation's a plus for banks. At least it has been over the last decade. So I think it's partly to do with mindset. It's partly to do with the role and relationships that you have as a banker, that you have those bonus schemes built around building relationships and winning big ticket businesses, those types of things. What you're saying to people is, look, instead of all that, what you really need to do is have a platform where you collect enough data on your client base that you can automate the loan book or whatever other service that you're offering. There's a question mark over whether banks do have enough data or would collect enough data to make that automation. But I do remember talking to HSBC some years ago, and they said nobody knows trade between Brazil and China like we know trade between Brazil and China. Okay, automate it. Automate the loans around that, the finance around that. But why don't they do that? I think it's to do with the traditional nature of building relationships and the sense that that's what you do. That's what your job is and what your trade is.
I don't know if you have some other examples you want to talk about successes and failures of developing an ecosystem. One case from financial services that I like to talk about a lot that's not totally well known is Market. It's now Market IHS, I think. And that was a consortium of market makers in the derivatives business. And they all faced the challenge that to price derivatives, you need complete market data and historical information to get the calculations about volatility right. And nobody had complete information. It was all split between the different over-the-counter transactions. So Market created a shared platform, pulled all the information into there, and then sold services to in fact, the same companies that owned it primarily. So interesting case. Any ones that you want to spend time on, or shall we move on?
I think that the fascination with platform and ecosystem business models, and let's give that some context. These platform and ecosystem business models are one of a number of alternative or optional operating models. So we've been very much, I think, shaped by the Porter model, which is a physical world model of stuff coming into an organization, stuff being transformed in that organization, and then going out to its distribution network. It's wholesalers and then retailers. And of course, banking has modeled a lot of its operations on that. And I think that started to break down almost as soon as it was in place. And I think since then, we've had a succession of operating model innovations. And I'm very, very interested in these operating model innovations. So the web changes the operating model of every firm that enters into a virtual relationship. Mobile globalizes that. AI is going to change it as well. Platforms and ecosystems are one option for how you then design and model your mode of operating. But there are other options. So you can think about things like data-driven operating models. If you look at Alibaba, the digital business operating system that they function with is really, really fascinating, because what it does is it integrates all elements of ingest and delivery. So you start to coordinate the activities of retailers in your city, say it's Beijing, but you're also coordinating the activity of the farms. And because you have data on demand, because you run fresh food outlets in Beijing, you know what people are buying on an intraday basis. You know on an intraday basis what kinds of produce people are buying. So you can send signals back to the farms, slaughter more pigs or pick more lettuce. And you can send signals to the logistics chain, optimize your pickups in this way, optimize your deliveries this way. You can send signals to retailers as well, which say, you are likely to get more demand for X, Y, and Z today. That's why we are sending you more pork. So I think that the potential of data-driven operating models, in the case of Alibaba, I think they call it their digital business operating system, but the potential of that to integrate along the whole supply and delivery chain is absolutely enormous. And the kinds of efficiencies it's going to give, right back to primary production, are incredible. So I think we need to distinguish things a little bit here. The platform and ecosystem model is one choice. The DBOS, if you want to call it that, from Alibaba is another. Lesser data-driven operating models are other options. So there are plenty of options, and I think in the financial sector, there's probably not enough attention being paid to how you design your operating model based on growing experience. Why is Alibaba able to do these things? Because basically it's a FinTech. It's the largest FinTech in the world, probably, arguably. But look how quickly it's evolving its operating model. Critical to see that. It's evolving its operating model all the time.
I like the idea of drawing a few distinctions, because in the 6 or 7 years that I've been talking about ecosystems rather enthusiastically, it's gone from being, buzzwords like ecosystem and people, hyping the word, to ideas that it's, a community, and of course also to platform business models and the stakeholders that participate in those. Can you distinguish a couple of the important ways that we talk about, for example, an innovation ecosystem versus a commercial one?
I think that, again, we're a bit hostage to this pre-web, post-web world. So before the web, you could talk about, not before the web proliferated, you could talk about ecosystems in a very simple way. And a lot of the early literature does that. It'll talk about SAP and its integrator ecosystem. Or it'll talk about Microsoft, Wintel, the Windows, Intel platform and its ecosystem of solution providers. That idea of the ecosystem gets carried forward, but it's a very narrow one, because what it means is that you're looking at the keystone, it's Microsoft or it's SAP, and the bilateral relationship it has with a lot of solution providers. And you see a lot of that carried over into discussions about ecosystems now with things like Uber. Uber has bilateral relationships with drivers. Drivers don't really have a relationship with each other. I think that the true meaning of the ecosystem comes out when those relationships are multifaceted. So if you look at something like the Amazon ecosystem, it's not Amazon having a relationship with the people that develop and improve its business operations. It might sound strange to say that, so let me give an example. In the Amazon ecosystem, Amazon owns, say, 50% of the actors in the book production and the book selling side of its business. So it owns the actual ingest, it owns the print on demand, and it owns Goodreads, where readers get together and discuss books. So those are very much, they own them now, but they were very bilateral. If you look deeper, though, what really makes Amazon function incredibly well are all the hundreds and thousands of companies that Amazon has no relationship with. I'll give you an example of that. There is a book arbitrage system on Amazon founded by people who enjoy books or know a thing or two about the Amazon search engine. And what they do is they go and they find books that they think have higher demand than Amazon can signal. They acquire those books. They might spend a couple of dollars on a book. They then create their own page for that book, a much better page than the original seller, and they sell it for $30, $40, $50. And they do that multiple times over because they know the Amazon system. They know how to do page descriptions, and they know the Amazon search engine. So effectively what's happening is that people are mining the Amazon inventory, and they are surfacing things that are of value in that inventory and making them more accessible. Those people have no relationship with Amazon whatsoever, but they have their own ecosystem. There are a lot of people that do book arbitrage. There's all kinds of literature around how to do book arbitrage well. There's literature on how to do good page descriptions, on how the Amazon search engine functions. Amazon's not really a search engine as such. It's more of a social engine, a contribution engine. So all those things become the ecosystem, and all those things are really driven by content. And I think that's the critical difference. This thing over here, bilateral relationships prior to the web, prior to global mobile, and this thing over here, all these multilateral threads of relationships that get built out through content.
Great to hear. We're big fans of high quality content at the center of the ecosystem, as we were discussing a little bit earlier. Maybe to take a bit of a detour into some of the more interesting topics that are on everybody's minds these days. Let's start with some of the FinTech topics that have received a lot of attention. Just to pick three that float around, there's the crypto or two. Crypto or blockchain is the first big one, but then also artificial intelligence. How do you think those are developing, and what are their implications for building ecosystems?
I thought those other subjects were equally interesting, John. So moving on to things like blockchain and AI, I think now we have levels of expertise in blockchain that we didn't have a few years back, obviously. I remember doing a couple of assignments in the City of London on blockchain in 2015, and everybody was a bit in the dark about how disruptive was this going to be. But disruption takes a long time. It generally takes between 10 and 15 years, a minimum of 10 or 15 years. And we are clearly around about the 10-year mark with blockchain. And so you would expect that it would start to be having an impact. I think that what's also interesting, though, at the same time, is that industry is moving towards micro-consumption, or the commercial world is moving towards micro-consumption. So I now pay Apple $1.99 for my cloud services, my cloud consumption. I think I actually was paying 99 cents. So we are moving towards micro-consumption. I think that's probably traditionally would have been the point at which things like blockchain would have become quite valuable, because you should have a much lower cost of conveyancing that value, trading that value, or monetizing that value. So I think that these kind of things are starting to align. Nonetheless, I doubt that we are going to get beyond, at least for another few years, the kinds of volatility and gamesmanship that's happening with Elon Musk coming into the Bitcoin market, for example. So it's still, I think, problematic, but I think that some of the underlying movement in the economy is much more favorable towards those kinds of systems. In terms of AI, I think that if you look at the way in which operating models change, what I think we find is that there are companies that acquire expertise in that new operating model very quickly and race ahead and become almost part of an exclusive club that does that well and gets that benefit. So there are platform and ecosystem companies that have done it extraordinarily well, and no other company will ever do it that well, or very few will do it that well. And it's not just about being the prime mover, the first mover. It's to do with acquiring all the expertise that it takes. The digital business operating systems that integrate all those supply chains are the same, and AI is the same. All the evidence is that very, very few companies actually get value from AI or can point to the bottom line contribution of AI. However, those companies that do will be marked out as something like the Exxon of data. They'll be the companies that dominate the economy for a long time to come. but they'll be few and far between.
COVID has had a big impact on all of these discussions, and I think you have a few thoughts to share on that.
Well, I think what we've been doing at the Flow Academy is we've been talking to a lot of companies about its impact on them, and I think what was happening early on is that companies did accelerate some elements of their digital transformation, and then sat back on their laurels to a certain extent. That they managed to get a lot of people doing remote work very quickly, and then sort of got into this cycle of, well, it's this lockdown's going to last another couple of months. Let's wait on our decision making until that's over, and then you get out of that and you're back into another lockdown. Okay, let's stall for a little bit longer. And I think that generally speaking, most companies have had not a year of COVID. They've had 4 3-month periods of COVID where they've delayed and delayed and delayed critical changes. But I think what's really going to happen around it is that what we now know is that we can massively accelerate change. And the vaccine itself is the evidence of that these vaccines used to take 10 years plus. They've been developed and approved within a year. And you have to say that that's probably going to be the lasting impact, that if you want to do something, if you need to make a significant change, there's no real excuse for it. 99.9% of companies are going to continue with their excuse factories. Okay, we can't because of this reason or because of this reason. But again, a bit like AI, there are going to be companies that say, we really don't need to spend a decade on this. And you might find it in things like cancer care, or you might find it in other areas of the economy where we spend absolutely massive amounts of money, spending all that money, taking a long time, getting nowhere special. That's been the case with a lot of therapeutics, not just in healthcare, though. I mean, there are other areas of industry where you could say, you might see acceleration, for example, in the energy sector, where domestic contributions into the grid have been talked about for an awful long time. In autonomous vehicles, I worked on autonomous vehicles 30 years ago. So, not new. But now I think that with all these areas, there's no excuse. There's no way in which you can just excuse it by saying, well, look, traditionally we've taken a decade, or we have to take a decade. There's all these reasons why we take a decade. Actually, you can do it in a year. I think that's the most profound long-term.
I tend to agree with what we've been doing. Actually, it's been a great boost. It's been a chance to sort of take a little bit more reflection and let technology help us make time in our lives, and then to look at how it's pushing things forward in terms of new ways of creating value more efficiently, excuse me. There was a great article, and I wanted to ask you about this. It was, I think, in the last couple of days in the New York Times, and it talked about the rationalist movement in Silicon Valley and a lot of the challenges of critical thinking. What do you think about the state of critical thinking when it comes to innovation and fostering new businesses that create value?
Yeah, well, again, another one of those extremely big questions, John. What do I think about that? I think that where you get really good critical thinking is where you get oppositional forces that are prepared to antagonize and debate each other. In almost every area of business, and I'm trying to think a bit more broadly than that, whether it applies in other areas of my experience, but certainly in the business world, there is no such dynamic. That once somebody nails that idea that it's going to be AI that drives us forward, or it's going to be the platform and ecosystem that becomes the operating model of choice, or in fact any other maybe the experience economy, or other types of ideas like this, they tend not to be challenged, or there tends not to be a forum in which they can be challenged. So we're very much in this mode, I think, at the moment. It's quite unfortunate. I'll give you an example, actually. I was working with a company that the CEO read a Harvard Business Review article that talked about product rather than project. We have to move from project to product, or from output to outcome. And came back to his bank and said, we were in the middle of devising this transformation program. Forget all that. It's about project to product. No debate, and the unfortunate thing is there was no debate in the pages of the Harvard Business Review either. And that's the big problem, that all science, and we try to think in terms of science in business now, experimentation, those types of things, but all science progresses through debate. So there is no rationality other than the kinds of lumps we can knock out of each other with adult, rational debate. And I think we've seen that in the political sphere as well over the last decade. But particularly, I think in business, we just lack at the moment, we lack the forum for arguing about things.
And I guess kind of like we've seen in the political sphere over the last century or two and throughout history, if you don't have that sort of forum for debate, things don't go very well over time, right? Flaws in the system don't get addressed. You don't find better outcomes, and yeah, it's unsustainable, isn't it?
It is. And one of the things that we do when we go into companies is we insist on having a period of a month where we talk to people at all layers of the organization, because management tends to think that it is the curator of truth in its on its patch. Interestingly enough, the CEO at one of these big box American companies, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of it now, but going back a decade, as soon as the web started to gain serious traction, what he did was created a prediction market inside his own company, and he had his staff bet on the projects that were going to succeed and those that were going to fail. And he was asked about this. So it was Best Buy, actually. I think it was Brad Anderson at Best Buy. And he was asked about, why would you do that kind of thing? Isn't that undermining your senior executives? He was saying, to some extent it does, but actually as a CEO, I never know what's really going on, because my executive team are always going to give me the positive story. They're always going to tell me that project's a winner. Whereas when I look at the prediction market, I see my staff are not backing it. They've been given some coin to show their support for projects, but they're not backing this. What's going on there? And what we try and do when we go into companies working on transformations is exactly that. So we don't have the prediction market, but we have the ability to talk to people at different layers of the organization and try and get at what's really happening and what the real conflicts are, what the real dysfunctionality is. And I fear that in transformation programs, what they tend to do is become very programmatic, and they don't look at dysfunction. Most companies share the same dysfunctionality. If you look at almost every bank in the world, there'll be core platform problems that they are not addressing because they've got a transformation program that ignores it. It ignores the dysfunctionality that their legacy has caused, legacy products and legacy platforms. So we do need to get more of a kind of a truth serum out there.
Legacy culture and values, I would also say, and legacy structure, a few things there that prevent from the paradigm shift at times. Maybe just coming back to it, when it comes to ecosystems and how to drive growth, why is that irrationality so important? I really want to make sure that we hammer home that point.
I think that a lot of the things that go on in business that help you succeed are things you can't manage. And management paradigms are all about what you can manage. Even worse, they're about, if I can't measure it, I can't manage it, therefore I won't do it. It's very difficult for organizations to understand that many of the things that they need to do, they're probably not going to be able to measure, and they're probably not going to be able to manage particularly effectively. Amazon cannot manage those book arbitrage services that I mentioned earlier, but they're absolutely critical to the success of an organization like Amazon. Not just the book arbitrage service themselves, but all the services, all the things that are going on around Amazon, the people that organize their own conferences, the people that publish books about Amazon. All these things reinforce the Amazon business, but Amazon can't affect those things. And I think that's the critical factor. The genius leaders of the future will understand that they can only manage half of what they do. They need to somehow affect growth in activity and commitment and resources around them that they don't actually control.
Almost a psychological balancing act, and it's almost quantum in the way that you have to balance the inside and the outside world. You have to control what you can, and then also accept the chaos around you.
I'm not sure that you accept the chaos around you. I'm not sure that that's. I do think that a lot of what we need to do is accept chaos. That human activity is chaotic and it is uncontrollable. You can suppress it, and lots of management systems are really about suppressing human instinct. But it probably is a good idea going forward to think, actually, this this chaos is good. It's not something that I need to shy away from.
Right. And so speaking of one of these fascinating business leaders who's championing new ideas, Elon Musk always makes me giggle because he does a lot of bad-mouthing the Master of Business Administration degree. And I'm actually also somebody who has critical thoughts about education and the need to speed and tighten the feedback loop up between practice and theory. But in my time when I studied at Oxford, I had two interesting experiences. One was that most of my classmates were aggressively shifting to entrepreneurship, and a lot of the programs and education was shifting to help enable that. And then I remember a dinner we had with some executives visiting from Tata, and it was funny because we were all looking at how to manage things and control things. And they sort of giggled and said, every day is a new discovery and a new challenge, and that's really what business is all about, is constantly evolving through these uncertainties and trying to find a path through the chaos. And that's leadership, I think, as well. Musk has challenged the idea of doing an MBA, and one of his peers from a FinTech startup, Peter Thiel, famously champions the idea that liberal arts education is being replaced by an entrepreneurial education. What do you think about the idea that sort of value creation is being democratized and the sort of skill sets that people need to embrace around that?
I'm not sure that it's been democratized, and again, a massive question, but one of the things that I tend to keep in mind when I hear about the entrepreneurial community at the moment is that possibly one of the more successful entrepreneurs of all time is Paul McCartney. He's managed his creative liberal arts genius to the tune of about £1 billion, 1 point something billion dollars. So there was something in the 60s, 70s, and 80s which was called music, and people create great businesses out of music. So I somewhat think that the idea that we are now in this other entrepreneurial period, which is somehow substantially different, is quite wrong. I think that what we have at the moment is a very, very substantial startup community around the world, but we have very, very substantial failure as well. Is that vastly different from the Beatles making it and my partner Finn's punk rock band not making it? I think that's we've got to broaden our sense of what entrepreneurship is about. It's about expression to a certain extent. I think it must be agony to go into one of these workspaces, these kind of rental things that there's loads of companies around all trying to make it, to pretend that your startup has got legs, or that it's just waiting that flywheel before it catapults into unicorns. All those things that you have to do to build expectation around your startup. I think we can think much more broadly about startups. Join a band, learn the guitar, or I don't know, grow plants. It's all business.
Yep. Well, tons of great points there. I love the Andy Warhol quote, who was also a businessman, but he talks about good business being the highest form of art. And obviously, Elon Musk has picked an artist as his partner, so that speaks to their success as well. And I think, again, as you say, we have all sorts of talents. There are different personalities in the world. And if you're coming back to creating value and being more authentic, there's different paths that entrepreneurship could look like. It doesn't have to be the Silicon Valley dream of a funded startup, does it?
I don't even think that. Is it a Silicon Valley dream? Are people dreaming about Silicon Valley wealth when they do startups? I think there's something crippling about the startup community. And I've actually done an entrepreneurial course, and I was told to do this business plan, and I was given the business model canvas. I think those kind of canvassy things are real suppressors. Why would you want to go and do all that stuff that you have to fill in on the canvases? That's to me not any better than doing an MBA. I think that we need to encourage people to be independent and to understand that their future will not be given to them by a company, even though it's been that way for a long time now. People still, I think, are educated to believe that their future lies within a company, even when they're entrepreneurial, and even when they've done entrepreneurial courses, or even when they're doing their own startup. They often dream about being bought. So So, that pull towards large organizations is still quite strong. But I think, on the other hand, it's something we really need to inculcate in people is try and create an independent path through life and try and do something that gives expression to something in you that becomes your way of making money. That can be teaching yoga, it can be joining a band, or it can be gardening. It can be all these things. It doesn't have to be something tech related, and it doesn't have to be inspired by Silicon Valley. It can be inspired by Body Shop, or it can be inspired by John Lennon.
Great food for thought there. Thank you, Haydn. I'd like to ask a final question before we start to wrap things up. You're a thought leader, obviously, and I always like to be a bit cliche as an MBA who is a bit of a disruptive entrepreneur and comes from Canada. Steve Jobs liked to quote Wayne Gretzky and talk about going to where the puck is going, skating to where the puck is going next, not where it's been. So with that in mind, where do you find inspiration in your life and in your work? What are some of the things that fuel your thoughts and your process?
Going back to something we were talking about earlier, this idea that we are not engaged enough in debate about what's next or what's right. We are, I think, enthralled to these sets of ideas. Like you said, are people really inspired by Silicon Valley? Well, we assume they are. Maybe they're not. And that kind of questioning of the way in which consensus quickly forms around these types of ideas. And that consensus forms around lots of different types of ideas as well. It is like AI is going to be the new orange for businesses. Well, we look into that. Let's look into it, because when you do look into it, you find that less than 10% of companies have made any coin at all out of AI, and we know from precedent that acquiring those skills is extremely difficult and it's going to be very rare. So challenging the easy consensus, I think, is where I tend to find motivation. There's something about not going to consensus that's really, really inspiring. Give yourself time. Don't just jump on that bandwagon. Don't just learn that rote and start to write your version of it. Actually give yourself time and look between the cracks. You often find that, rightly so, those people are wrong. Everybody's wrong. In all of medicine, everybody's wrong. Everything we know about cancer is wrong in some way or other. Everything we know about stomach ulcers is wrong. And it's the same in business. Everything we think about Silicon Valley has to be wrong, because we need to move on. We need the next idea. We need to find inspiration to challenge this consensus. So for me, it's that kind of thing. Look, it's all wrong. Let's find another way of looking at it.
Radically accepting the mystery of the universe is something that, I find an interesting concept as well. Haydn, I have to be careful because I could go on all day with this discussion. Are you interested to share some final thoughts, especially about your work and those who are interested to do more with you?
Well, it's an interesting one. My partner and I at Flow Academy, Finn Goulding, we've written Transformation Sprint, where what we're trying to do with that book is something of the critical thinking that we've been talking about. We've been trying to say in that book, most companies will never be able to design the appropriate operating model. There was a stable operating model, there is no longer. But every transformation program assumes that you can describe the future operating model. Deloitte will do it for you, cost you a few $100,000. And then your job is to sort of, push and pull and shape people to get into that new operating model. What we're saying in the book is actually, you're probably never going to get there. If you look at all the changes that happen in operating models over the past 10, 20 years, companies are actually dealing with 2 or 3 transformations all the time at any one time. So what you really need to do is create a learning environment where you can learn what it is you really need to be doing next. What's the next most significant change you can make? Because you're going to have to make a lot of changes a lot of the time. So we've tried to devise a method there where people can create that learning environment and figure out how to design the next significant change, but to be doing that all the time, to do it cumulatively. So you gain more and more experience in operating model design. And if anybody's interested in that idea, first of all, buy the book. But secondly, we haven't thought hugely about creating an ecosystem around it. It's something we want to do, but we've only just published the book, so we're just about onto that. If there are people that have an interest in trying to figure out better ways to design operating models, get in touch, because we can probably do some business together.
Excellent. Sounds very exciting. And you also mentioned before we started recording that you have some events coming up, so we'll be sure to follow up and share that with our audience, as well as all the links to your material and how to contact you in our description. Haydn, wishing you a great day. Thank you again for joining us and sharing all your wisdom. It's been a pleasure.
Great job.
Cheers.
Thanks, Ed.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.